Greetings and welcome to this webinar. This is the webinar on China, the United States, and the risk of nuclear war. My name is Michael Klare. I will be the moderator this evening for the webinar. And I'm very pleased to have all of you, whether you're listening on the East Coast of the United States or elsewhere in the United States, or from China or elsewhere in the world. This event is intended to address the risks of a nuclear event occurring as a result of tensions between the United States and China. It is the result of collaboration between 4 organizations in Massachusetts. They are the Back from the Brink of Western Massachusetts, the Committee for a SANE U.S.-China Policy, Physicians for Social Responsibility of the Pioneer Valley, and the Sojourner Truth School for Social Change Leadership. Our 4 organizations jointly believe that the growing tensions between the United States and China, if not moderated, could result in a military clash between China and the United States in the South China Sea or in waters surrounding Taiwan or near Japan, leading to a Cuban Missile Crisis-like event and possible nuclear escalation. We worry in particular about the rising tempo of Chinese and United States naval maneuvers in the South China Sea and in waters off Taiwan that seem to be increasing on a day-to-day basis. And if you want to see a tally of these events, you could go to the website of one of our organizations, the Committee for a SANE U.S.-China Policy, and look under provocative actions. And you will see that the tempo of these events and the size of them seem to be increasing week by week. This webinar is intended to analyze the ways in which a nuclear conflict could arise from a clash that might arise in these waters that would escalate into the nuclear arena, and how the US and China can avert such a clash. And we have assembled a very extraordinary group of panelists to address these matters. And I will introduce them momentarily. But first, some technical matters. We will provide ample time for your questions. To submit a question, use the chat function next to the video image. You will need a Google account and a YouTube channel or account to use the live chat function. So if you see a sign in the chat, if you see a sign in to chat or a create a channel to join the chat, click on the prompt and follow the instructions. If you already have a Google account, you can create a channel very quickly, and making a Google account doesn't take much longer. All right, the webinar will proceed as follows. I will introduce all 3 speakers momentarily. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to address their issues, their assigned topic, and I'll describe that briefly. And following each speaker, I will pose a question to each of them to elaborate on the points that they've made, and I will give the speakers an opportunity to address a question to each of them if they so wish, and then we'll proceed to questions and answers. The 3 themes this evening are as follows. The first topic is what are the possible scenarios that could spark a conflict between the US and China that might escalate into the nuclear realm in the South China Sea and Taiwan. That will be addressed by our first speaker, Rachel Esplin Odell, and I'll introduce her momentarily. The second topic is, what are the nuclear weapons use policies of the US and China in such a circumstance? And that will be addressed by Tong Zhao. And the final topic of the panel is, what are the strategies that can be developed, adopted to prevent such escalation from occurring? And that will be addressed by Zia Mian. So let me briefly introduce describe and introduce the three speakers, and then we'll move quickly to their presentations. Rachel Esplin Odell is an expert on US strategy in Asia, Chinese foreign policy, and the intersection of maritime security and international law. She is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. And she will address, as I say, the first topic about scenarios for a possible escalatory clash. Tong Zhao is an expert on strategic security issues, especially nuclear weapons policy, arms control, and China's security and foreign policy. He is a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based in Beijing at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. And we're very grateful for Tong to join us today. He's speaking with us from Beijing, where it's now 7 a.m. in the morning. And we're very grateful for him to get up this early to be with us. Zia Mian is a physicist and an expert on nuclear weapons and arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament. And he is co-director of the program on science and global security at Princeton University. Like myself, he is a board member of the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. So we will now turn first to Rachel, who will speak, as I said, on the scenarios that might spark a conflict between the US and China. Rachel, please unmute and proceed. We're very pleased to have you this evening.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to be a part of this panel and speaking to this group, and grateful for all the work that all of you do to advocate for more stable and peaceful US foreign policy and to prevent nuclear war. So looking forward to this conversation tonight. And I'm going to focus on just providing some background on the most likely scenarios or contingencies where the United States and China could find themselves in war with one another. And I'll leave it mostly to Tong to talk more about whether or not these scenarios could escalate to nuclear war, given the nuclear postures and doctrines of the United States and China. But I will sort of briefly touch upon some of those matters. The three main scenarios that I want to look at are the South China Sea, as Michael mentioned, also the East China Sea, in particular the dispute over the Senkaku Islands, or Diaoyu Islands, two different names for the same island in between China and Japan, and then third, Taiwan. And I think these are the most likely areas where conflict could take place between the United States and China. And I've sort of listed them in roughly ascending order of how likely nuclear exchange would be. In other words, I judge nuclear use to be quite unlikely in the first two disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, but not impossible if it were inadvertent or unintentional, or at least from the start, it could escalated inadvertently. But I think it is a somewhat greater risk in a Taiwan scenario, even though there are still, some reasons why it probably wouldn't go there. So I want to just briefly share my screen to show a map to familiarize everyone with the location of some of the places I'll be talking about. Okay. And zoom out a little bit. So as people can see here, we've got, I'm showing Google Earth view of the Western Pacific of East Asia. And this, of course, here is China. And up here is Japan, North and South Korea. Here we have the Philippines, Vietnam, Southeast Asia. And I think it's always helpful to me to sort of remind myself of geography to see where these potential conflict points are and, how they be likely to unfold. It's also, worth noting that the United States, Hawaii is here, the United States is here, Alaska is here. So, this is pretty far from US territory. However, of course, the United States has foreign military presence throughout the region and also in Guam and especially in Japan and South Korea. So that's pertinent to the risks of war taking place, given that direct US-China war and nuclear escalation is of course more likely when it directly involves the United States and US personnel and US territory. So first on the South China Sea scenario, the South China Sea, the disputes in the South China Sea are very complex multi-party disputes, not just between China and some other countries, but among 5 different claimants. Some of these, there's 2 main different island groupings in the South China Sea, and countries dispute sovereignty over these islands. These are largely uninhabited. Some of them do have sort of permanent, mostly military or government personnel stationed there, but they don't have their own sort of organic local communities living on them. They're quite small, and they have historically sort of been used by fisher people, but they haven't sort of been permanently occupied in at least continuously across time. So zooming in a bit, these are the what are known in English as the Paracel Islands. Chinese, they're called the Seashaw Islands. They have a different name in Vietnamese. They're disputed between China and Vietnam, but China currently occupies all of these islands. China and Vietnam fought a sort of naval battle skirmish over these in the, I think it was 1979. It was in the 70s or 80s, but these have been since that time have been occupied by the PRC. One other important point here is that Taiwan, and we'll talk more about the Taiwan case, but the Republic of China government on Taiwan, in essence, sort of shares China's claims in the South China Sea. They both claim these islands on behalf of China, since they both sort of claim to be the rightful government of China. And so they also claim these islands, but they're not really in direct competition with China in that claim. And then down in the southern portion of the South China Sea, closer to the Philippines and Malaysia and Brunei, you have what are known as the Spratly Islands. And there's something in the order of 200 different land features. Many of these are reefs, or there may not be above water at high tide, but some of them are large enough to sort of be islands with flora and fauna and some fresh water. And China only occupies 7 of these reefs and islands, and I've noted all of those with these yellow markers. Vietnam occupies 29 and Philippines occupy 11. And most of these occupations took place between the 1970s and 1990s. And they sort of took place in part in response to discoveries of oil resources in the ocean seabed in the South China Sea, and in response to developments in international law when it comes to claims to natural resources. And these, the largest island in the South China Sea is occupied by Taiwan, actually. And then Malaysia also occupies several islands. Brunei claims some of the islands as well, but doesn't actually occupy any of them. So these are very complex disputes, not only between China and these other countries. However, and of course, the United States doesn't have any claims to any of these islands. There's also a shoal known as Scarborough Shoal you'll hear about in the news sometimes. That's up sort of separate from the others. That's disputed between China and the Philippines. And the issue, there isn't a high likelihood of large-scale war over these islands with China, in part because the United States does not have an official position on who controls the sovereignty of these islands. We're neutral on that question, although over the last decade, the United States has become more involved in the disputes. And of course, through these military freedom of navigation operations that Michael alluded to, and other military exercises in the region, as well as the United States has taken a position that some of China's claims to maritime resources in the area, and in particular its claim to Mischief Reef, which was not, before China sort of built it up into an artificial island, wasn't above water at high tide. The United States has taken the position on siding with an international arbitration award that some of China's claims are excessive and not in line with international law. So, but the fact is that in these disputes, the only U.S. ally that's involved is the Philippines. So if conflict were to break out between the United States and Vietnam, or between China and Vietnam or other countries, the United States likely wouldn't get involved. The United States has said that it would defend the Philippines in a conflict over, that took place in the South China Sea as part of the military alliance. But this commitment is a little bit vague and unclear if what such a commitment would actually entail. And so even if a conflict were to break out, it's very unlikely that it would escalate to the home islands of the Philippines. I don't think China would escalate it to that point. And so it's really hard to imagine nuclear weapons being used in this situation. That said, I think there is the risk of clashes or accidents between the US and China, given how frequently both sides are operating in the South China Sea militarily. This risk in some ways has gone down over time as the US and China are operating more regularly together, and as they've as the PLA Navy has become more professional, and so they're less likely to have accidents take place than they might have in the past. But there could be intentional accidents, if you will, or intentional escalations in order to sort of seize the advantage in these disputes that could lead to some, but maybe Tong can speak more to that. Now, the other dispute I just want to briefly discuss is the Senkaku Islands, or that's how it's referred to in Japanese, and in Chinese, it's the Diaoyu Islands, which are a small group of islands northeast of Taiwan and north of the southernmost Ryukyu Islands, or in the Okinawa prefecture of Japan. So these are the southernmost Ryukyu Islands, Ishigaki and Miyako, and the Senkaku Islands they are north of those, and I try to zoom in so you can sort of get a sense. They're completely uninhabited, and they're under the administrative control of Japan. But in the last decade or two, China has increasingly sort of operated Coast Guard and sometimes naval vessels in the waters near the Senkakus, and does that on a regular basis now. And these are also, unlikely to escalate, but I actually think the risk of U.S.-China war of the Senkakus is somewhat greater, given the fact that the United States has a significant forward presence in Japan, and the U.S.-Japan alliance is stronger than the U.S.-Philippine alliance. And the risk, and the United States has publicly committed itself, even though it doesn't take a position on sovereignty over the Senkakus, it does recognize Japanese administrative control and has publicly committed itself to defending Japan in a conflict over the Senkakus. So this is, given that the United States has military presence here in Okinawa, quite close, I think this is more likely to potentially escalate, from action-reaction strikes. If China were to strike U.S. bases on Japanese islands, then the United States might strike back, and over time it could escalate. And then the last scenario I'll just touch upon is the Senkaku Island scenario, the Taiwan scenario. Now, this is sort of qualitatively different from those I've already described, in that, Taiwan has 24 million people living there. It's viewed by the PRC government on the mainland as sort of the product of an unresolved civil war, where after the Communist Party defeated the Nationalist Party in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan and has controlled it. The ROC government has controlled Taiwan ever since. And they were in a sort of unresolved state of war for a few decades, but eventually the PRC normalized relations with the United States, and the US used to have a defense treaty with Taiwan, but abrogated that treaty and sort of now acknowledges just one China, and acknowledges China's position that Taiwan is part of China. Now, Taiwan views it somewhat differently, in that as over time Taiwan is democratized and has two major parties, and one of those parties is not, the Nationalist Party that originally went to Taiwan. The other party, the DPP, is is not as inclined to accept the sort of standard one China policy and various other consensus agreements that were more negotiated between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, and is somewhat more pro-independence, and also doesn't really see this as an unresolved civil war. There were many indigenous Taiwanese people, or Chinese Taiwanese people who've been living on the islands much longer than before the Nationalist Party came there, and they feel that they don't want to be reunified with China. So anyway, this scenario, the United States no longer has a formal military alliance, but we have sort of an ambiguous policy. We have the Taiwan Relations Act passed by Congress in 1979 in response to normalization that did commit the United States providing some defensive weaponry to Taiwan, and to sort of taking note and sort of consulting if military force were used against Taiwan. There's no defense commitment there, but the United States military has definitely planned around what the United States could do to defend Taiwan. So I could go on about this forever. In the interest of time, I'll wrap up, but I think that perhaps Tong will speak more to the risk of nuclear escalation in this situation. I think it's still quite unlikely, and that China it has a no first use policy and doesn't have any desire or strong incentive to use nuclear weapons against Taiwan, given that it wants to, reunify. It sees this as part of its own territory and wouldn't want to sort of create a nuclear wasteland in Taiwan. But there are real potential risks for nuclear escalation in a conflict between the United States and China, having to do with dual use concerns with different weapon systems, among other matters. So I think this is where the United States and China really need to think more about how they can engage in nuclear risk reduction measures and prevent the likelihood of conflict, given that danger of nuclear escalation. Oh, and I'll stop sharing, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel, and showing us that map, which is very, very helpful in getting an understanding of the region. Very helpful. And now I ask Tong to unmute, please. And Tong is going to help us understand the nuclear weapons policies of China and the United States. Tong, please, you have the floor. Please.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think for the last few decades, the risk of a nuclear war involving China has been relatively low for several reasons. China has maintained a relatively modest nuclear posture, including its unconventional no first use policy. China promises never to use nuclear weapons first under any conditions. Also, China is believed to have kept its nuclear weapons on a low alert level during peacetime. And reportedly, China also separates most of its nuclear warheads from their delivery vehicles, or other words, from their missiles during peacetime. And all these measures have contributed to reducing the risk of nuclear war. And I also very much agree with Rachel when she talked about all the potential flashpoints around China involving territorial disputes between China and its neighbors, including Taiwan. I think the best scenario from the Chinese perspective to resolve these territorial disputes is to gradually build up China's overall military capability and to gradually shift the balance of power to the favor of the Chinese military. So when China has an obvious military advantage over the combined armed forces of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region and its regional allies, then China could basically advance its territorial claim or defend its territorial claim and achieve unification with Taiwan without having to fire a shot, because everyone by that time would understand it would be useless to try to resist Chinese claims, and so all the disputes could be resolved peacefully. I think that's the ideal outcome for China. So in this scenario, there is no explicit role for nuclear weapons in the Chinese strategic thinking regarding the territorial disputes. However, I think in recent years and also going forward, there are a few new factors that may affect the chances of nuclear conflict between the US and China. The most important factor in the long run, I think, is the fact that the Chinese population and the American population, including their experts and decision makers, are increasingly living in two separate information bubbles. They absorb different information and therefore develop an increasingly divergent views on even basic factual issues. That means they have increasingly divergent perspectives on a wide range of foreign policy issues, international relation issues, etc. That's the fundamental source of strategic distrust between the two sides. For example, Chinese population, including the Chinese experts community, increasingly believe the US is deliberately picking trouble with China on issues of Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc., not because of any of Chinese behavior, but because the US is worried about China's rise and potential Chinese challenge to the traditional American dominance in the region. So the US is making up those excuses to undermine China's peaceful rise. Given the very divergent view about each other's strategic intention, I think that's the greatest driver of hostility between the two sides. And on the Chinese side, people believe that in order to counter the perceived hostility from the United States, China needs to have a more powerful military, and China needs to adopt a tougher military policy. And there have been calls for China to build a massive nuclear arsenal and to change its traditionally modest nuclear posture. And much of the domestic dynamics is driven by a top-down process. Chinese top political leadership, Chinese paramount leader Xi has personally requested all Chinese officials to adopt the so-called fighting spirit in the face of perceived greater American hostility. And we have seen Chinese diplomats become more assertive on the international stage. My concern is the same factor will also affect the cost-benefit calculations of Chinese military officers when they conduct patrols in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait, and when they encounter American vessels or American airplanes, they will have a stronger incentive to appear very tough and appear very determined to defend Chinese perceived national interests. They cannot afford appearing weak in these encounters. So even though there has been rules of unplanned encounters between the two militaries, my concern is that the domestic incentives will motivate the Chinese military officers on the front line to behave more assertively in future conflicts. So the risk of some incidents happening and the risk of such incidents escalating to higher levels are increasing, in my personal view. And there is this traditional Chinese view that nuclear weapons and conventional weapons are two categorically different types of weapons. Conventional war is very unlikely to escalate to the nuclear level because all countries understand, the use of nuclear weapons means the destruction of human civilization. And therefore, the traditional Chinese view is there is a firewall between nuclear and conventional conflicts, and it's very hard to escalate a conventional war to the nuclear level. So the risk of a conventional conflict somehow inadvertently escalating across the nuclear threshold is very low. And because of this traditional view, I think it also increases Chinese willingness to behave more assertively at the conventional military level. For a long time, conventional military threats from China are not a problem for the United States, which has long possessed an obvious conventional military advantage over China. But now the power balance is shifting, and American experts start to worry that if the trend continues, if China continues to acquire more conventional military advantage in the Asia-Pacific theater, then the US might lose its traditional superiority, and in a future conventional conflict with China, the US may be at a disadvantage. And so there may come a day in which the US may need to consider threatening a limited use of nuclear weapons against a possibly more powerful Chinese conventional military in this theater. And also, if you look at the relationship between US and Russia, the US worries that Russia is emphasizing the role of tactical nuclear weapons in Russian military strategy. And as a result, the US is also re-emphasizing the role of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons in American nuclear strategy, and has been developing new types of low-yield nuclear weapons. But China, the Chinese interpretation of the American change of nuclear policy is that China ignores the part that about American worry towards Russian nuclear strategy. It is only focused on American change of policy. So from the Chinese perspective, the US is deliberately developing low-yield nuclear weapons for nuclear warfighting purposes. And this means, from the Chinese perspective, the US is trying to intentionally lower the threshold of nuclear use. So the US is deliberately preparing for nuclear warfighting. That's the Chinese interpretation of American nuclear policy. So this, I think, misunderstanding between the two sides is also increasing the risk of nuclear conflict. And China, for many years, has been investing in its theater-range nuclear weapons. China has DF-21, DF-26 missiles that can, fly over distances of a few thousand kilometers. But there is no clear strategy of when and under what conditions China will use these theater-range nuclear weapons. And if you look at their potential targets, the targets for China's theater-range nuclear weapons are likely to be American military bases in this region, including those in American allies' territories. So this would increase the American concern that the Chinese military is preparing to use these theater-range nuclear weapons in a conventional war. So the lack of clarity over the employment strategy of China's theater-range nuclear weapons is another factor contributing to concerns of greater risks of nuclear use. And also at the theater level, the nuclear weapons and the non-nuclear weapons are more entangled than at the strategic level. If you look at China's DF-21 and DF-26 missiles, there are conventional versions of the DF-21 that look very much like the nuclear versions of the same missile. So it is very hard for an enemy to distinguish which is the nuclear version, which is the conventional version. As for the DF-26 missile, as Rachel mentioned, it is a dual-capable missile. China can hot swap warheads on the battlefield, and depending on whether China wants to launch a nuclear or conventional strike. So it makes it impossible basically for the US to know if in a conventional crisis, if the US is seeing China mobilizing a DF-26 missile unit and ready to launch, the US won't know whether those are nuclear armed or conventionally armed. And if Chinese DF-26 missiles are attacked in a conventional war, China won't be able to tell, is the US intended to attack Chinese conventional forces, or is US actually intended to attack Chinese nuclear forces? If it's the latter, then China might consider a nuclear retaliation. So the dual-capable nature, the entanglement between nuclear and conventional forces at the theater level very much increase the risk of misunderstanding during a crisis and the risk of inadvertent escalation. But these risks have not been fully recognized by China. China has developed the dual-capable missiles primarily because it's economically, easier, cheaper and logistically easier to handle, and it provides military flexibility. But it has not fully appreciated the potential risks of misunderstanding and inadvertent escalation. So it is building more of these dual-capable missiles right now. So maybe more attention actually needs to be paid to the theater level, because if there is a real risk of nuclear escalation, those theater nuclear weapons are more likely to be involved than strategic nuclear weapons. Of course, China's traditional policy like no first use would help moderate the risks, but even for no first use policy, it faces some new challenges. China is increasingly worried about conventional military technologies' capability to threaten Chinese nuclear weapons. So there will be more ambiguity about China's no first use policy going forward. And also the reason China adopted no first use policy in the first place is that during Mao's era, China believed that it could take massive conventional casualties in a conventional war. So China was able, China had a very high level of unacceptable damage during the revolutionary years. But now the Chinese people have been enjoying a good living standards for decades, and China had very little experience of taking high casualty in a conventional conflict. So if China indeed had a huge casualty in a conventional conflict in the future, there is no guarantee that China would be able to take it without resorting to escalating further including to the nuclear level. So
Tom, I think you have to conclude, if I could, right. Please.
Yes. Yes. One last point. If based on the now publicly available English translation of Chinese internal document used by the rocket force, the no first use is basically a political decision to be made by China's top political leadership. It's up to them to decide when and under what conditions to use nuclear weapons. So there is no legal or institutional guarantee that nuclear weapons will never be used first in a conventional conflict. So a broader point is, many of these developments are increasingly driven by the military and the defense industry because of greater availability of resources. They are driving the Chinese development of more nuclear technologies and capabilities. And the issue is, when the capabilities become available, China will be tempted to shift its military posture accordingly. But there is no real domestic checks and balances to push against the advocacy for greater nuclear capabilities by the military and defense industry. So those domestic trends will continue and won't be able to change anytime soon. So I will stop here, and sorry for going on for so long.
Tong, thank you so much. All the information you provide is so valuable. So I would like you to continue for longer and longer, but I would love now to have Zia give us some thoughts about how we could address the issues that you've raised and that Rachel has raised. What are the things that we could do to reduce the risks that you both have mentioned? But Tong, thank you so much for that incredibly thorough and worrisome presentation. So,
thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tong. Let me begin by recasting some of the comments that Rachel and Tong made into a framework that lends itself perhaps a little more easily to trying to think about a path out of the situation that we may be finding ourselves in, which necessarily won't capture all of the complications that both of them have described. But let me try. The first is that when Rachel showed the map and mentioned about the distance between the United States and China, an obvious question for a US audience, because that's who I'm going to be talking to, because in one sense, the place where political action is possible for most of us on this webinar is actually in the United States, is that why is something that, and a place that is so far away, of such importance to the United States military and political leadership? Mozambique is far away. And we don't have all these conversations about what are we going to do about Mozambique. Right? The tip of South America is that far away, and we don't have these complications about. So one of the things that we have to think about is that it's not actually the distance, it's the history that matters here. And the history that matters here is the history that put the United States in China even before the Chinese Revolution, interfering and involving itself directly in Chinese domestic politics in particular ways as part of a practice of European and foreign colonialism. That also explains in part, when we fast forward to World War II, why there are what we now call US allies in the areas that Rachel showed in her map. Once upon a time, the idea that Japan would be a US ally would have been laughable. Right? And yet this is now a place where the United States is willing to threaten nuclear war to protect. And similarly, some of the other places that Rachel mentioned, I mean, one only has to think back about the history of the United States and the Philippines to ask the question, so what is the United States now doing standing up for maritime rights of the Philippines against China? So there's a history of US imperialism, US military operations, and a US search for global dominance that shapes why a distant place has become so important and important enough for the United States to threaten. It's not Cuba that we're talking about. We're talking about the other side of the world. And if you think about it in that way, then the obvious thing that one should keep in mind is that when the Cold War ended, the first response of the US political military leadership was to say never again. And some people will remember the famous defense planning guidance that was developed under the first Bush administration by Paul Wolfowitz and others in the Pentagon, where the leading goal of US foreign and military policy was declared to be to prevent the rise of even a regional competitor to the United States. Never mind a global peer adversary, which is what we talk about when we talk about China now, or at least an emerging global peer adversary. No one was going to be allowed to even become a regional competitor to US power. So the US was going to be dominant absolutely and relatively everywhere. And so let me connect that to then the question of what are we going to do about it? And what are we going to do about it? When we listen to Tong Zhao talk about US and Chinese public views and expert views, it's worth keeping in mind that at least in the United States, where there is a lot of public polling of public opinion that reveals profound divergences within US opinion. And those divergences matter in the light of where we can go, because it depends on who holds what opinion and for what reason, and where they're located within the political social structure. So on the one hand, there's been a rapid and dramatic increase in the proportion of Americans who see China as a competitor or straightforwardly as an enemy, especially over the last decade. And about half of Americans, according to polling released earlier in 2021, think that China, limiting China's rise and its power in the world should be a top foreign policy priority. But that means half of Americans don't think that. They may be concerned about China's human rights record, they may be concerned about trade imbalance, but they don't think that a top priority of the United States should be to limit China's rise. In other words, they're the kind of people that would not support the path of the threat and use of force and the possibility of war and the possibility of escalation to nuclear war as something that the United States should pursue in terms of its relationship with China. So we have this profound division, and I can't speak about the scale of divisions within Chinese domestic public opinion. And this 50% that I'm talking about Americans, a few years ago, it was less than 1/3. And so that leads us to one obvious thing about the way forward. Where has this shift in American public perception towards China come from? And part of it actually is top down. Even though America prides itself on its democratic processes and so on, there has been a definite attempt to cultivate a particular US position about how to understand, explain, and tell the story of US relations with China and China's relationship with the rest of the world. You would be hard-pressed to find any story in a major US news outlet that said something nice about China, something positive about China. China builds trade infrastructures with third world countries. Oh, this is an attempt of China to capture the third world and dominate. When the US did it, it was called development. People in the third world also saw it as the US trying to monopolize control over domestic economies in third world countries. Many people in those countries now see the Chinese doing the same thing. But when the US tells the story, it's the bad Chinese doing something that we would never do, even though the US did exactly the same thing in its own way, wherever it could for a very long time. So this process of shifting American opinion in particular directions has been an effort. It's been contested, but it has been an effort. So we have to be aware of what's been going on and what the story is that's being told. And the last point I want to make about public opinion that helps us think about a way forward is that the divide that is there on how to think about and respond and engage and imagine the US relationship with China. If I had to ask people to imagine for a minute what they thought the structure of opinion was, based on the things that I've said, it wouldn't be hard to come to the conclusion that older people schooled in Cold War ideas of American dominance would be more anti-Chinese than young people who were born after the Cold War. And you would be right. The polling opinion shows clearly that older people see China as much more threatening and more of a competitor and more hostile, and therefore demanding more use of threat and force and pressure in US efforts to counter it than younger people do. The use of force, threat, pressure, etc., is also a typical controlling, patriarchal, masculine way of thinking about the way the world works. And lo and behold, men much more than women see this view of the US needing to deal with China through threat, use, force, and risking war and so on. And lastly, it also has to do with education. The more educated the people that you ask, the less likely they are to support the use of force, threat, war, and risk tension, escalation, conflict, crisis, and war as the path for US-China relations. So I think that when we think about a path forward, we have to begin with first asking, what is the political and social terrain on which this contestation with US state priorities, US military priorities, US geopolitical and geoeconomic ambitions is going to be playing out on? And there, I think that the first thing we have to think about is, how do we address these narratives that are unfolding? And how do we think about building the kind of stories and political formations, movements that actually focus on the origins and sources of US conduct that lead to the kinds of crises we're talking about, rather than focusing just on what do we do with the crisis as it unfolds. We have to deal with the conduct of the origins of the policies that lead to these kinds of situations. And it's for folks in China to deal with their domestic social, political, and cultural processes that drive these processes forward, as Tong Zhao was mentioning. And if we are to refuse crisis, tension, escalation, and war from the US side with China, then we're going to have to refuse a lot more than just the question of China. We're going to have to deal with these core issues about how Americans see their role in the world. Why should be the ones that dominate across the planet and across time? It's worth remembering that there used to be something that we call the neoconservatives, but they call themselves the Project for a New American Century. In other words, America should control 100 years. And if you control time, then you automatically control space. And it's that is a necessary part of the political debate that we have to have about how America sees its role in the world. On a more practical level of, where do we think about this? Now, we've been in some of these places before where, as Tong mentioned, and as Rachel mentioned, space, proximity, weapons of certain kinds become more important to one side than the other. It's no surprise that the Soviet Union also had lots of short-range weapons, and the US had lots of bases and troops in Europe. And eventually what they came up with at the end of that was that they had to deal with intermediate nuclear and conventional forces, and they ended up with a structure of treaties at the end of the Cold War that combined restraints on strategic weapons, intermediate range weapons, nuclear as well as conventional weapons, and normal conventional forces, right? There were agreed limits on tanks and artillery and troops and military exercises to deal with exactly the possibility of things running out of control. But that assumes that you're willing to accept a certain balance and not domination. And so, again, I come back to my earlier point that the first issue here has to be for the conversation in the United States to deal with this urge to dominate and to accept that it has to find a balance that China is willing to accept in China's neighborhood. The other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that when the United States realized that the Soviet Union had achieved strategic parity, didn't have to have the same number of nuclear weapons, but it had to achieve a proven ability to sustain competition at the strategic level, technologically, militarily, politically, with the United States. We got détente, and we got the 1973 Agreement on the Prevention of Nuclear War between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which both sides said, look, we've got lots of nuclear weapons, even though the US has a lot more, but we know that nuclear war would be disastrous. And so they agreed in 1973, at the same time as the US is making the opening to China, right? When Nixon and Kissinger are going to see Mao to talk about the opening of China, they're also talking to Brezhnev about this agreement on the prevention of nuclear war. And it was agreed that the objective of their policies of the United States and the Soviet Union would be to remove the danger of nuclear war and of the use of nuclear weapons as a simple political commitment, right? That nothing we're going to do should lead us to nuclear war and to the use of nuclear weapons. It would seem to me that a simple demand from the US peace movement side and of people from the US who seek to prevent crisis escalating into war, escalating into nuclear war, is to begin at least to rebuild this idea of a firewall between crisis and nuclear war, and making the case for a US-China prevention of nuclear war agreement that says we may have our differences, but an objective of both our policies, of both countries in this contest, should be to make sure we remove the danger of nuclear war and of the use of nuclear weapons. Everything else we can figure out later on, but this at least is something that we can agree not to do. And then there are regional processes and issues like an East Asian nuclear weapon-free zone and so on that one can talk about how to balance these kinds of things. But I think, let me stop there and have more of a conversation with everybody who's on the call. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zia, for providing us with that framework way of thinking about how to address this issue. I found that very helpful, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. I had said earlier that I would ask each of you a question. I'm going to forego that in the interest of time, so we could move soon to questions from the audience. But I want to give each of you three an opportunity, if you so wish, to comment on what the other panelists said. If there's something that that any of you wish to elaborate on a point that they raised, or join something you said and they said before we go on. So I'll give in turn Rachel, Tong, and Zia a chance to comment on what the other panelists said, if you so wish. So Rachel, if you would you please unmute and add anything or comment on anything, if please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I thank you so much to both Zia and Tong for your excellent remarks. I learned a lot and appreciated it. I guess one thought I had, in addition to some of the comments that Tong made about how changes in nuclear thinking and essentially the security dilemma unfolding between the United States and China could create risk of nuclear escalation. I also think it's sometimes useful to sort of flip the causal arrow, you might say, and think about how U.S. nuclear posture, or perhaps China's changing nuclear posture, could in some cases itself raise the risk of conventional crises. And one of the examples that I think, or areas in which I think this plays out, is in the South China Sea, where because the United States has a nuclear strategy of damage limitation rather than no first use and mutually assured destruction, where we actually have the objective of being able to destroy a potential adversary's nuclear forces in an overwhelming first strike, that sort of requires the United States to maintain full awareness of the presence of all the adversary's potential, of all of their nuclear armed submarines, the SSBNs, and other nuclear capabilities. And so, of course, damage limitation is in many ways an absurd nuclear strategy, and that's a topic for another time. But I think that the United States' failure to adopt a no first use strategy is tied up with the frequent U.S. operations in the South China Sea, where we're doing something in the order of 1,500 to 2,000 surveillance and reconnaissance operations along the Chinese coast every year. And so this ties back into Zia's point about, why are we doing this in an area so far from the United States and from, US territory? And I think this is, our nuclear strategy is one of those reasons, is because we have this, the Chinese nuclear submarine force, SSBN force is based at Sanya on Hainan Island in the South China Sea. It's the only sort of a naval base close to deeper waters. And so that's where they have their largest naval base. And we are regularly sort of monitoring that area for sort of anti-submarine purposes. So the linkages between nuclear strategy and potential conflict really flow both ways.
Rachel, before you go, could you just explain in a sentence or two what a damage limitation strategy is? Because maybe not all of our listeners know what that means.
Yeah, I mean, this comes out of nuclear thinking, and Tong and Zia could speak probably more to this than I could, but it comes out of nuclear strategic thinking from during the Cold War, when U.S. nuclear strategists were thinking about different ways of designing and utilizing U.S. nuclear weapons and nuclear structure, and one of these was, if you were to sort of just accept that both sides poses an existential threat to the other side, then you wouldn't try to fight and win a nuclear war, where you actually try to destroy all of the other adversaries' nuclear weapons so that they can't get one off to take out one of your cities. And damage limitation is a strategy where essentially the United States would try to destroy as many of the adversaries' nuclear weapons as possible in a first strike. And you might not catch all of them. They might still get one or two off and take out one or two American cities, but you would limit the damage of a nuclear strike from the adversary. And then you could take out as many of their cities as you want to bring them to heel. I mean, it's this sort of absurd kind of Strange-Lovian nuclear strategy, but that is essentially still US nuclear strategy, is retaining the ability to do that. And with China, because they have such a smaller nuclear force, I think we sort of maintain that strategy, even though we wouldn't be able to eliminate the risk. We would only be limiting it. So.
Thank you. It's a very troubling what you say, but it's important that we understand that point. Tong, would you like to comment on something or add additional words? You could unmute.
Thank you. I very much appreciate Zia's comment. Of course, if things become so bad that the risk of nuclear war is so serious, then of course the priority should be to prevent a nuclear war, and other issues should be put aside. But there is always a trade-off. Right? As you said, there are different opinions in the United States that can be freely expressed, whereas in China, you don't see that. That's not because there is no diversity of views, it's just because there is no environment for those views to be expressed and heard. And some people in China may feel that they are suffering under the current domestic trajectory. If countries prioritize the stabilization of relations, and those internal troubles will never be resolved, and those people who think they are suffering will be hopeless. So there's always a trade-off. You can prioritize the stabilization of relations, but some people argue you should prioritize resolving real troubles that affect people's lives and everyday life. So I don't know. I understand your view, but I think we need to develop a more sophisticated approach, so we don't give up resolving real suffering today.
Thank you so much, Tong. And now, Zia, would you like to comment on what Tong just said, or any other points that have been raised? You have to unmute, Zia. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to open this up now to the audience for this, and have their questions and comments.
Well, thank you everybody for really superb presentations. I'm sure our audience was very much enlightened by everything that you said. I certainly was, and I'm going to come in with some questions later, perhaps, but I will raise some of the questions that have been brought to me from the audience. So one question that several people asked me, and I'm going to ask Zia to address this because you have some experience, but any of the others can speak to this. This question is, what are the possibilities for opening track 2 diplomacy and track 1.5 diplomacy? And maybe you could explain what that is, between experts in US and China that could bridge some of the conceptual gap, the gap in perceptions that Tong explained so well between the expert and scientific community between US and China. How do we bridge, how do we overcome that perception gap? Can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, it's been thought for a long time that having people talk to each other begins to clarify their differences and lay out space for the possibility of reaching common perspectives on issues through various kinds of official engagement between government officials or between military personnel, or some combination of independent scholars, academics, activists, and officials together from countries that are having a tense or adversarial or competitive relationship. And there's a long literature and many practices that one can point to. And the idea even of summits where presidents and leaders meet directly to speak with each other is part of this notion of certain kinds of political engagement. And that the practice of communication in and of itself can help lead to ways of ameliorating tension. But let me point out that the United States and the Soviet Union talked to each other throughout the Cold War. And the United States and Russia have been talking to each other in the 30 years since the Cold War. There have been countless summits, countless expert dialogues, and yet we see the situation of US-Russian relations today, right? With thousands of nuclear weapons on each side and an increasing reliance on both sides to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. And so I think that one has to be more self-aware about the limits of those kinds of dialogues in the absence of other kinds of political processes. And here I think is where we do have space for thinking about how different the US-China relationship is from the US-Soviet and the US-Russian relationship. Right? I mean, there is no doubt that the US-China relationship now is very different from what it was 20 years ago, and certainly very different from what it was 20 years before that. There are thousands upon thousands of young Americans who've had the chance to study in China. That was never the case in the Soviet Union and has barely been the case in Russia. And similarly, there are tens of thousands of young Chinese students who've taken the opportunity to come and study in the United States. There are huge business interests and a large diaspora. And let me focus on one thing, given where we are in the American trajectory today, right? The rise of racism directed at what in the US they call Asian Americans, as if you can tell whether somebody is a hyphenated American or not just by looking at them. right? It is racism directed against Asians. You don't know whether they're Asian American or just Chinese or South Korean or anybody else. Most Americans couldn't tell the difference, and they don't care when they're being racist. So one of the things that we have to do at a fundamental level is to deal with these elements within US society and culture that for a very long time have had these specific culturally, politically shaped perspectives about other people based upon race. This wasn't so much the case with Russia, but it's very much the case with regard to China. And so I think one of the things that the American peace movement in particular can do is to take very seriously its engagement with these questions of the role that racism plays in shaping the US political and economic perspectives with regard to China and how to deal with China and to deal with its own internal problems with people who are Asian. So it can't be just let's focus on dialogues about war and peace and the threat of use of force. You actually have to deal with issues much closer to home and that are in their own way much more difficult to deal with, about how Orientalism with regard to people of Asian origin has played itself out as a core element of American politics, economy, culture, and society for the past 200 years, if not.
Thank you, Zia. We've had several questions about the South China Sea, and I'm going to ask Rachel, please, to address those. And then I have a question for Tong. But first, Rachel, several people asked about the role of the other countries in the region and what role they might play in the disputes between the US and China. Do they have any agency? And another question is, what role should the US play in supporting those countries when China engages in what people call bullying behavior towards the Philippines or Vietnam or the others? And I know you've worked on this issue, so perhaps you could talk about that.
Yes, happy to. And before I answer those questions, I just wanted to briefly add on to Zia's comment. I think that this point about the danger of anti-Asian racism is a really important one. And I would just recommend to people that they consider joining a webinar that the National Committee on US-China Relations is hosting on this subject next Monday. One of my colleagues at the Quincy Institute, Jessica Lee, who's a Korean American and was previously the executive director of the Korean American Association, is going to be speaking on that panel. And also Representative Judy Chu, who is a member of Congress and the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, will be speaking, and also Ian Shin. So anyway, if you go to the national ncusr.org and click on their events tab, you can learn more about that. But I think this linkage between the sort of negative shift on US-China policy and attitudes towards China and anti-Asian racism, and of course the pandemic is related, is tied up with all of this, I think is an important thing to bring attention to, and a reason to sort of push back against excessive China bashing in the US. But to the points about the South China Sea. So, I think that these questions are interrelated, and I guess there's two sort of separate. I think it's useful for the United States to some extent to separate out concerns about freedom of navigation, which is usually the sort of rhetoric that's applied in the South China Sea context, and the concerns about the disputes over islands and reefs and over marine resources in the South China Sea. And I think that where the United States has more clear interest at stake is in the former category. Free commercial and military navigation through the South China Sea is arguably an interest of the United States. It's even more so for China. They're even more dependent on that free navigation. But China hasn't threatened freedom of navigation through the South China Sea, and they haven't shown any intention to do so. It would harm them more than anything. They do object to, very frequent U.S. military operations, as we've discussed, but that's a different question, I think, than obstructing freedom of navigation. So, but in disputes over territory and these largely uninhabited islands and over the marine resources, some of China's claims have been more excessive, and I think less aligned with, customary international law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this poses a real challenge to the United States because we're not a claimant in these disputes, and we also have not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And in some ways, some of our maritime claims don't, just one small example is the United States claims exclusive economic zones, 200 miles of resources around a lot of very small reefs and islands in the Pacific that we control. And the arbitration award in the Philippines versus China case that was decided in 2016 that China rejected and didn't participate in, but nonetheless, that award from a tribunal set up under the Permanent Court of Arbitration, found that little reefs and islands, in fact, none of the islands in the South China Sea are entitled to exclusive economic zones of 200 miles. And that is at odds with US practice and with the practice of many, especially former colonial powers that have these small islands throughout, sort of scattered around the world's oceans. So, there's some sort of inconsistencies and problems with the United States sort of taking a position on these disputes. And, China's claims, I won't go into the details of the areas in which some of its claims are excessive, but it's also not, the dynamics in the South China Sea are not solely driven by negative Chinese behavior. There have been cases where Vietnam or the Philippines, themselves engage in provocations or escalations in the South China Sea, and then China sort of reacts to that, and perhaps in not a proportionate way. It sort of uses an opportunity to increase its presence. And to some extent, that was why China engaged in, reclaiming the land and building up artificial islands around a lot of its small territories. It felt like it had been taken advantage of in the Spratly disputes over the decades because it had been relatively restrained by not moving in and occupying these islands, whereas the Vietnam and the Philippines had moved in, had occupied these islands in a way that was quite provocative in the 1970s. And so they had gotten the best islands first, essentially, the biggest ones. So China was stuck with these little reefs that were barely above water at high tide. So they sort of felt justified in eventually, building those out into islands that they could use and put an airstrip on. These other countries already had airstrips. So, these, of course, then this is portrayed as extremely provocative behavior. And in some ways it was what China, the scale of reclamation China did was more significant than other reclamation done by other countries. And it is destabilizing to have any sort of change in status quo in these islands. But, then China would make an argument that they were doing that, and perhaps in part in response to prior provocations from other countries. So it's just so complex, and the United States sort of lacks standing in some ways that I'm not convinced that our engagement in these disputes actually helps the situation. Over the last decade, we've been getting more and more involved, and China's just been doubling down on its position, increasing its presence in the region. I think it actually makes it harder for China and these countries to reach compromise in the disputes because China feels like it would be showing weakness against the United States, which is threatening its own sovereignty and security. So, I think that a better approach would be to adopt more of a position of neutrality in these disputes. Yes, to stand up for international law while being somewhat humble about our own sort of lack of respect for international law in many regards, and reducing our military operations, which I think pose a risk of destabilizing the disputes further.
Thank you, Rachel. And we're going to run out of time soon, so I'll ask you to keep answers as brief as possible. But Tong, there's a question that I'd like you to answer, and that is about the dual-use weapons that you described. And the question is it conceivable to envision a treaty or some kind of agreement between the US and China to limit or ban these dual-use intermediate-range missiles, the INF prohibited type weapons? Can you conceive of a US-China treaty that might do that, and how might we get there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, to ban the dual-use missiles would require, firstly, a deep appreciation of the problems with these weapons. And I don't think that has happened. So we need a process of raising awareness first, and that is taking time. So if in the future there is greater awareness about the risks, then maybe there will be some interest in doing so. But so far, I haven't seen that interest. And also this is related to different countries' interpretation of each other's behavior in this field. The US, for example, has been studying these issues for many years, and because of the concern of entanglement, the US has abandoned some military programs, including the conventional Trident program, in which the previous, the Bush administration was thinking about arming its submarine-launched ballistic missiles with conventional warheads. And then that was cut off partly because the concern that this would make nuclear and conventional missiles indistinguishable and will raise risk of escalation. But from the Chinese perspective, that American effort to separate conventional and nuclear weapons, there was very little awareness of that effort to begin with. And then the Chinese experts basically believe that the US pressure on China to abandon dual-capable missiles primarily aiming at preventing China from developing the most effective military capabilities. It is to undermine China's legitimate right to develop self-defense capabilities. And the US itself also has dual-capable weapon platforms, including aircraft that can launch nuclear and conventional bombs. So they think this is completely hypocritical effort from the United States. So there also need a process to help both sides better learn each other's behavior and each other's internal debate and discussions. So in that regard, I think more dialogue could be helpful.
Thank you. And I have another question, Tong, that you might answer, but any of the other panelists can. And then that will be followed by a second question that I'll mention now, given time. So the first question is, Tong, how do you interpret President Xi's long-term goals? What do you think that his vision of China's rise actually means, assuming that it would be within his power to achieve? What would that look like? So that's one question. And then I'm going to ask all three of you to think about, or maybe Rachel and Zia to think about while he's answering that question. We have a couple of people have asked about how we in the US should think about how do we proceed on to build peace and disarmament with China, and also address the oppression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China, and the suppression of human rights, civil rights in Hong Kong. How do we do both at the same time? So maybe you could be thinking about that while Tong, if you could talk a little bit more, you alluded about Xi's grand vision.
I think Xi thinks, he only wants to advance China's legitimate national interests, which from his personal view is to achieve China's dream of national rejuvenation, making China a successful country again, a proud nation that can defend itself, protect its legitimate interests. There is no aggressive intention to expand Chinese control or Chinese sphere of influence. So it is perceived as a purely self-defensive objective. However, in order to achieve those views, on the military side, for example, China thinks it has to be able to deter American military interference if China wants to achieve unification with Taiwan, or if China wants to fully defend its territorial claims in the South China Sea. So that requires China to build a more powerful military than the American armed forces in the Asia-Pacific region. And also, in order, to increase Chinese domestic coherence and stability, China feels, and China's top leader Xi believes he has to use strong measures to eliminate separatism and extremism in Xinjiang and other regions. He has to use force to stabilize situations in Hong Kong. And in order to make those workable, he has to ask Chinese media and diplomats to defend those positions internationally. So even though the goal is very self-defensive, it requires tactics that look like a very aggressive campaign to spread misinformation, etc. So that's, I think, how the clash between China and the rest of the international community arises.
Thank you, Tong. And could either Rachel or Zia, are you willing to take on the question about how to proceed on, two fronts simultaneously? Why don't you go ahead, Zia?
Sure, but before I do, let me take 1 minute and just add to a comment about what Tong just said. A more appropriate question for Americans to ask is not about President Xi's vision of the future, but about America's vision of its future. And I suggest that when we have a political structure that is struggling to deal with its decline, as the United States has been doing now for 2 decades, where you had the Obama vision of managing decline by certain kinds of processes, and the Trump vision of decline, which was to reject decline and make America great again, which clearly accepts that there has been decline, but that the counter to it is then to find your way out of it in a particular way. The question is, how do Americans see their future? What place are they willing to accept and work for as a member of the international community and as a society in good standing? Because that is actually much more consequential in shaping the larger geopolitical trajectory than President Xi's vision, given the continuing predominant role that the US plays as a military, political, and economic power in the world, in part because of itself and its historical legacy and its structure of allies and its control still of key institutions and processes in the world system. So the key question to ask is not only is President Xi's vision of the future, but the American vision of their future. Are they going to be willing to accept a new place for themselves as one among other states, or will they try and recreate dominance in various kinds of ways? This is the question that I think we need to engage with. On the question of the Uyghurs and so on, we had similar debates back in the day of the Cold War about how are we going to deal with human rights in the Soviet Union at the same time as talking to them about the threat of nuclear war, peace in Europe, and all of these other things. So there's a certain kind of narrative continuity that comes. What was missing back then and what is missing there is that we also need to have, as part of that conversation, how does the United States deal with these issues at home and in the places where it controls, never mind what China does to its people that it controls. The treatment of the Uyghurs in China is terrible. The United States continues to have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and it is disproportionately directed at people of color and especially African Americans. And given what the United States does with regard to human rights in places where it controls, the United States should, as part of any conversation about what China does, should ask the question, what do we do? The United States, unlike China, actually kidnaps people from other side of the world and imprisons them for decades without trial in Guantanamo. It kills people, it tortures people. And we know this for fact. And any conversation about human rights anywhere must include the conversation about what the United States does to American citizens, to undocumented people seeking to gain access to the United States, and to what it does in its own conduct everywhere else in the world, right? There's an old saying in the Bible, be careful about pointing out the problems in your brother's eye without seeing the problems in your own. And I think this is a key element of the discourse that we need to always keep in mind.
Thank you, Zia. And I will give the panelists one last chance to make any final comments, but otherwise we're going to wrap up. We made a commitment to end on time at 8:30, but that is East Coast time, 8:30 a.m. tomorrow in Beijing. Do Rachel or Tong want to have any last comments? If not, we'll wrap up. No? Okay. So first, I want to thank our sponsoring organizations. I'll mention them again. The Back from the Brink of Western Massachusetts, that's Back from the Brink of Nuclear War. The Committee for SANE, U.S.-China Policy, Physicians for Social Responsibility of the Pioneer Valley, and the Sojourner Truth School for Social Change Leadership. Thank you for putting this together. We did so with the intent of better understanding what were the possible circumstances that might lead to a nuclear war between the US and China, and how we might prevent that from happening. And I want to thank the panelists again and again for really superb and informative presentations. I learned a lot from this. I hope those who are listening did as well. Thank you for your presentations. And with that, I'll say goodnight to everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you found this as informative as I did. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. It was a great panel.
Thank you.